Human civilization has come a long way since the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Yet if we could step back 2,000 years into the world of the Roman Empire, we'd be in for a great surprise. Incredibly, ancient doctors carried out brain surgery, eye operations, and even cosmetic procedures. Next on Modern Marvels, Ancient Discoveries 2.
Incredible discoveries by archaeologists and historians have shown that complex medical procedures were in everyday use in Roman times. Skills that have been lost for thousands of years and only recently been reinvented. In a time without electricity or modern drugs, it is amazing to realize that doctors in the ancient classical world carried out over 130 surgical procedures, which are almost identical to those taught to medical students today. As more intriguing clues are uncovered, it is becoming clear that the Romans were able to carry out many forms of dangerous and difficult surgery. You may have been safer in the hands of doctors in the ancient world than you might think.
Roman medicine is extremely impressive. If one looks at their methods of observation, if one looks at their diagnoses, and if one looks at the sort of operations that they carried out, one can see that this was not surpassed for perhaps another 1,500 years.
Modern medicine has changed our lives dramatically. Just 200 years ago, surgery was still a brutal and bloody lottery. But today it has become a precise and successful science. Yet hidden within ancient texts lie secrets which reveal that many of our modern scientific discoveries were already known 2,000 years ago. We now know a Roman doctor would have recognized a modern set of medical instruments and would have been just as highly skilled and trained in their use as a doctor of today.
We tend to think of scientific medicine and surgery as modern-day inventions. We like to imagine that if you were ill in the past, you might just wear an amulet or take a couple of magic potions or just pray to the gods. And to be fair, if you landed up in hospital in medieval Britain, that would be a reasonable description of what might happen. But the classical world is a completely different story and a much more sophisticated story. Many modern medical and surgical practices were not invented by us, they were reinvented by us.
The doctors and scientists working in medical theaters like this one in the early 19th century were the pioneers in their day, living in the great age of medical discovery. But perhaps some of their ideas were not as revolutionary as history books have led us to believe. "2,000 years earlier, Greek and Roman doctors were carrying out operations, including eye surgery, bladder operations, fusing broken bones, and even a type of brain surgery. The most highly skilled of all these ancient surgeons was an extraordinary doctor and philosopher whose invention and ambition drove him to become the greatest medical expert of the Roman era. His name was Galen of Pergamum.
Galen was a genius, arrogant, he's learned, he's observant. All these things tell you about somebody from the past in an immediate way that's very, very rare.
Galen lived in an age when Roman dominion stretched from Europe to North Africa and the Middle East. His home was in Pergamum in modern-day Turkey, a civilized and wealthy Roman city in the eastern reaches of that great empire. Galen's father, a cultured architect, claimed he was told by the god Asclepius in a dream that his son should become a doctor and there were few better places on earth for Galen to learn. Pergamum was a center for science, invention, and medicine. The perfect place to begin his extraordinary career. Only one place could teach him more: Alexandria in Egypt. When Galen was just 19 years old, fate took a hand. The sudden death of his father gave him an inheritance, which allowed him to travel. So it was to Alexandria that he came, the home of all the knowledge of the ancient world. The famous library of Alexandria was the place where Galen found inspiration. Years before, when the Greeks had ruled this city, their leaders had allowed scientists to dissect human bodies in the quest for knowledge, something that was taboo in Galen's day. Their incredible discoveries about anatomy were still kept in the library, and it was here among these books that Galen's fascination with the workings of the human body began. Even in Galen's time, the liberal Alexandrians still allowed the study of human remains, such as skeletons, something forbidden elsewhere. And this would give the young aspiring surgeon his first great opportunity. This was a time when little was known about how the body worked, and few people even dared to examine it. But in Alexandria, Galen could freely look and learn. While most people trusted their fate to the gods, Galen was determined to control life and death, to become the greatest doctor who ever lived.
Bandages for wounds have been used since ancient times, but the modern-day bandage was perfected in 1920. Earl Dixon invented the Band-Aid for his wife, who had many kitchen accidents and needed a quick wound dressing. Modern marvels will continue in a moment.
In Roman times, if you were sick and lived anywhere within the Roman Empire, you might have come to a place like this. This is an Asclepion. It was like a modern-day spa, with areas to rest and be healed. There were doctors here, but at the Asclepion, healing was very much in the hands of the gods. To be cured required praying to Asclepius, a great figure shown with a staff and a mighty serpent. Offerings were made to the god in the form of carvings of the part of your body which needed to be healed. All manner of stone carvings have been discovered, from hands and feet to ears, eyes, and even a breast. The god Asclepius may today have been forgotten, but his staff and snake have remained an enduring symbol of medicine which survives to this day.
The surgeon needed all of his abilities. He also needed the assistance of the gods. And in this instance, he found that assistance by having his instrument manufacturer make the terminal in the form of a serpent's head. So both the healer and the patient, who had belief in that healing deity, had a very positive attitude to the operation, which is a particularly beneficial part of ancient surgery.
Following his training in the Library of Alexandria, Galen traveled to Pergamum to take up his first professional appointment as a sports doctor. This was an era when the original Olympic Games were still being held, and the chance to tend these top sportsmen offered him the perfect opportunity to study bodies in peak physical condition, as well as to learn about the injuries they suffered. Then, as today, typical injuries included sprains and torn ligaments. And Galen used surgery, massage, ointments, medicines, and rehabilitation programs to cure these. So effectively did he use the knowledge he gained in Alexandria that he would later be called the father of sports medicine. Sport was an obsession in the Roman world, from the gruesome spectacle of the gladiators to the classical Greek games at Olympia. Audiences demanded to see the very best from their athletes. In running, discus, and javelin, the hopes of an entire city or nation might lie in the hands of one athlete, and failure was unthinkable. To our eyes, some of Galen's treatments may seem very strange, such as the one he recommends for fractures and dislocations. The treatment involved a doctor laying out his patient on a bed called the Hippocratic bench, named after its inventor, the great Greek doctor Hippocrates. The bed was designed to stretch the patient's body. He was strapped into the device using soft leather bindings. His legs were then raised and stretched using a handle which pulled the bones, ligaments, and tendons. It might look like a medieval torture instrument, but in fact it's not very different from traction beds used in modern hospitals today. Instead of wood and leather, we use metal and plastics, but the theory is the same. Using tension to align broken or dislocated bones ensured they set straight and the athlete fully recovered. For those who could not afford Galen, a far worse fate awaited. This skeleton from a poor Roman grave shows a typical broken leg bone, which fused in an incorrect position. Galen's patients would have been far more fortunate. Galen's work was impressive, so impressive that it brought him to the attention of the organizers of a very different sport, gladiatorial combat. This brutal, bloody sport left many combatants wounded or crippled. Even a minor wound in the arena could be a death blow as infection set in. Galen would boast that in his first year as their doctor, none he treated would die. His secret lay in how he treated wounds, cleaning them with sponges soaked in wine, and early use of what today we would call antiseptics. Galen could also see that some of the vicious wounds his gladiators received wouldn't heal if simply bandaged. In cases where the wound was wide or vital muscles and tendons had been severed, he intervened, performing operations to stitch the separated ends of tissue together. To help in his work, Galen used and improved on the available surgical instruments, some of which have survived almost unchanged to the modern day. So important were a Roman doctor's instruments, he might even have them carved on his tomb. In rare cases, some of the actual tools that would have been familiar to doctors like Galen have survived, such as this set found in 1996 in the grave of a doctor in a village outside Colchester in England. So important was this exquisite set to its owner that he even had them buried with him. From this find, it was possible to reproduce this doctor's instrument set, a beautifully handcrafted collection of tools that even a modern surgeon would recognize. Galen was even more particular. He insisted all his tools were made to his exact specification, using only a fine type of iron from the Roman town of Noricum, which could be forged into what was effectively the first surgical steel. The British Museum in London contains some of the finest examples of Roman medical instruments. Ralph Jackson, curator of the Roman British collections, is gaining a new insight into the sophisticated world of ancient surgery by studying them.
The craftsmanship really is unsurpassed until very recent times. The instrument that I'm holding, which is a sharp hook, used primarily to hold back the edges of wounds or incisions, has two parts. It has a decorative handle and it has the functional end, which terminates in a very, very sharp, beautifully turned hook, which did the work.
By placing a set of modern tools next to the ancient ones, striking similarities appear. All that really separates these instruments is the materials they are made out of. And of course, nearly 2,000 years.
Roman surgical instruments are stunning. They are really marvellous pieces of craftsmanship, and yet you also know, as you handle them, that they have been inside people's bodies, performing operations that are described by Galen and the ancient writers. The instruments themselves could not have been bettered.
But Galen, now in his early 30s, was about to pack up his instruments and move on. His fame was spreading beyond the limited horizons of his hometown of Pergamum. He went to Rome in search of fame and fortune.
In 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell became the first American woman to graduate from medical school. Her application to Geneva Medical College in New York was thought to be a practical joke. Her fellow students were horrified when they realized their classmate was indeed a woman. She graduated first in her class. Modern Marvels will continue in a moment.
When Galen arrived in Rome, it was the busiest city in the world. Everything here was bigger and better, from the wealth of his private clients to the bloody excesses of Rome's own gladiatorial games in the vast amphitheater of the Colosseum. Rome's gladiators were the empire's finest, the superstar sportsmen of their day. Saving their lives could literally save their owners a fortune. But healing gladiators didn't just bring Galen money. In a world where fighting to the death was allowed, but dissecting humans was banned, the terrible injuries they sustained gave him the chance to glimpse the inner workings of the human body. While these men brutally dissected each other, Galen could watch and learn. Where other doctors appealed to gods or resorted to potions that were little more than folk magic, Galen observed his patients, examining their symptoms, diagnosed the problem, and suggested a cure. His methodical treatment of the human body as a machine was revolutionary and forms the basic technique for medical inquiry to this day. To add to the grisly revelations of the games, Galen did dissect other animals to explore their inner workings in the hope it would shed light on the human body. These experiments, often carried out in public and on live animals, even caused uneasiness in his own day. But these were more than gruesome shows. By tying threads around nerves in the animal's neck, He showed how he could stop animals moving or making a noise at will. Even in these distressing displays, Galen was laying down the ground rules for neurosurgery. Galen's brilliant reputation and flair for showmanship eventually brought him to the attention of the greatest Roman of them all, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. From now on, Galen would be entrusted with the health of the first family in the ancient world, as court physician to the emperor. It was the pinnacle of any doctor's ambition, but it was not without its own very real risks. Ensuring the health of the most powerful man on earth, a man with enemies, was no easy matter. And when the emperor's young son fell ill, Galen may have felt it was not just the boy's life that was at risk. But his treatment was successful, and Galen would be kept close by the emperor for the rest of his reign. Galen, always the self-publicist, wrote tirelessly on medical subjects, compiling hundreds of books to spread his techniques across the empire. And as Galen prospered, Roman medicine flourished, as witnessed by the huge numbers of medical instruments that survived from this time. One such instrument is this perfectly engineered speculum, which was discovered in Pompeii. It may have been used during childbirth or surgery. It may be made of bronze, but it would have been just as effective as a similar device used today. As a physician to the emperor, Galen's services were now in demand among the wealthiest citizens, such as the inhabitants of the prosperous town of Ostia Antica, outside Rome. Away from the blood of the amphitheater or the intrigues of court, these people had different health priorities. Their town had sports stadiums, baths, and a gymnasium where Galen treated everyday injuries. It also boasted the latest in plumbing and sewage disposal, all built into the fabric of its public buildings and private homes. This was a town where hygiene and health, not life and death, were the priorities. While most of the world's population worried about keeping alive, the wealthy people here could worry about just staying in perfect condition. They wanted cosmetic surgery, and doctors like Galen could provide it. One curse of the Roman aristocracy was bad teeth. While most peasants eating only a simple diet had good teeth, Romans fed on luxury did not. The solution was false teeth. Originally invented by the Etruscans, they were also known to have been developed by the Romans and made from either human or animal teeth, or sometimes ivory or bone, and held together by a band of gold. Many of the techniques used were similar to dental techniques of today. Dr. Paola Catalano from Rome's Archaeological Service made one such discovery when she was working on a site in a mausoleum in Rome. This is the only example of Roman false teeth ever found from the 1st century.
I denti sicuramente umani e non animali, questo senz'altro. Non abbiamo la sicurezza assoluta che i denti inseriti nella protesi siano dello stesso individuo che è stato trovato nella sepoltura.
The teeth are held together using fine gold wire, and amazingly, threads of silk can still be seen which were bound around the teeth.
Questo caso indica comunque che i romani in epoca imperiale facevano questo tipo di interventi, anche se è l'unico caso che noi abbiamo recuperato, abbiamo trovato.
Other types of cosmetic surgery were also in use.
Ancient doctors could remove tattoos, they could repair damaged earlobes where an earring or a mark of slavery had been torn from the ear. They even practiced breast reductions, though one author says not for cosmetic purposes.
Perhaps Galen himself removed slavery tattoos in the dark vaults of the Colosseum after a successful gladiator won his freedom in the arena. To help with the inevitable pain of such operations, Galen wrote of the sedative effects of opium and alcohol on patients. In many cases, however, sheer willpower was all that was available. It was now that Galen would attempt the most difficult and challenging operation he had yet undertaken: eye surgery.
The first human heart transplant was performed on December 3, 1967 by Dr. Christian Barnard. The 55-year-old recipient lived for 18 days. Modern marvels will continue in a moment.
Willpower and a steady hand were always called for in the case of one of the most incredible operations carried out during the Roman period: eye surgery. Romans, like us today, could suffer from cataracts, a clouding of the lens in the eye that can lead to blindness. But also, like us, they had a cure: a delicate operation.
Cataract operations seem to be common. It's a very simple operation in which you put a very thin needle into the eye and flip over the lens. And we've got lots of instruments, mainly from France, but elsewhere in the Roman Empire, that seem to show that this was a common procedure.
The technique known as couching involved the use of a very fine needle. Surgeons would expertly insert the needle into the back of the eye to remove the cataract. One slip could have caused permanent blindness. In some developing countries today, the technique of couching is carried out in exactly the same way as it would have been by Roman doctors. A unique find in Montbellier, France, has revealed an even more advanced technique in ancient eye surgery.
These instruments were found in a bronze tube on the bed of the River Saône, so they're very well preserved. And as well as 3 solid cataract couching needles, there are 2 needle syringes.
These amazingly delicate syringes were at first a mystery. It was only when the tools were X-rayed that their secret was revealed. Using these radiographs, modern eye surgeons could then begin to explain what they were for.
This is an even more sophisticated instrument, and it's a very cunning piece of design in that it's a hollow instrument with a introducer. So with this, it would be a more sophisticated operation of being able to enter the lens itself, and then the surgeon would remove the needle from within inside and be able to suck the lens contents out through the small port.
But for Galen, performing delicate operations on the rich and famous in Rome was not to be the end of his career. Emperor Marcus Aurelius knew there was only one body more important than his own: the body of the army. Marcus Aurelius wanted Galen to go to war. It was the Roman army that held the empire together, and so it was vital that as many of its soldiers were as fit as possible, as often as possible. If they were healthy, then the empire was healthy. And if the empire was healthy, then Marcus Aurelius was happy.
The one group in the Roman Empire whose health matters more than any other is, of course, the army. The army and its fitness and its health and its ability to recover the strength and prosperity of the empire depended. It's not surprising then that the Roman emperor was interested that Galen should turn his skills and resources towards helping the army and investigate how quickly best to mend fractures, to heal wounds, to keep the army as fit as possible.
Of course, treating soldiers was very different from treating civilians. Most doctors would never dare cut into the body of a civilian because of the risk of infection. But with soldiers, the enemy had often opened up the body for them. Saving these soldiers was the key to military medicine. Having spent years treating gladiators, Galen knew all about wounds and the risks of infection. And he knew the best place to cure them was in a hospital. These were the first true hospitals in the ancient world, specialist centers for the treatment of soldiers. Walk into one, and you would have walked into a surprisingly modern world. Through the gatehouse, there was a light and spacious ward. Beyond was the operating theater, projecting out into the courtyard to allow the maximum amount of light for the surgeons. In one corner stood a complex of baths with a block of flushing toilets attached. Hygiene was very important to doctors like Galen. In the other corner stood the kitchens, where the healthy, balanced diets required by convalescing patients were prepared. In the other wings lay a series of small wards designed to reduce the risk of cross-infection. There were also consulting rooms, a dispensary, and for the unfortunates that not even the great Galen could save, a mortuary. The Roman hospital really was an incredibly modern institution. And it's not just in the layout of the building, but the whole approach to how patients were treated. Thanks to people like Galen, a soldier in the Roman army was more likely to survive conflict than at any other time up until the First World War. Some wounded soldiers may even have had the benefit of modern sterile surgery. In an operating theater at a hospital in Nice, raised hearths were found. These were probably where the surgical tools were sterilized in the fire before use, just as Galen suggested. As the years passed, Galen was slowly putting the jigsaw of human anatomy together, thanks to his work in military hospitals and in his own private experiments. By examining the organs of humans and animals, their different functions were becoming clear to him, something he knew was essential if he was to truly understand how the human body works.
Galen believed that in order to understand medicine, you had to know anatomy. He himself worked almost entirely on animals, though as a surgeon, he'd cut up human bodies. He carried out experiments on the nervous system. He believed you needed to know how the body was organized in order to be a good doctor.
Most remarkably, Galen made the connection between the brain and the nervous system. He knew, for example, that a problem with paralysis of the hand might be treated by manipulating the spinal cord, and that a symptom in one place might be caused by a problem somewhere quite different. That was Galen's great difference. He identified and treated the problem, not just the symptom, as most doctors did. Nowhere was this more important than in treating head injuries incurred in battle or the arena. Galen realized the brain controlled the whole body. He was such an accomplished surgeon, he attempted the impossible: surgery on the skull and brain.
The first contact lenses were made in the late 1800s by a German physiologist. They were made from heavy brown glass and were 18 to 21 millimeters in diameter. Modern marvels will continue in a moment.
Blows to the head might produce symptoms all over the body, from paralysis to pain. But Galen realized the key was to treat the problem area on the skull. To do this, a section of skull would have to be removed to relieve the pressure and remove any bone splinters pressing on the brain, a process called trepanning. There is evidence for crude forms of this procedure dating back into prehistory, although we don't know if it was performed for medical or magical purposes. But until recently, it was assumed that this operation could only have been performed successfully by modern surgeons, as the risk was infection or damage to the delicate structures of the brain would have made ancient attempts impossible. But then an extraordinary series of skulls began to come to light. In the History of Medicine Museum at La Sapienza University in Rome, one skull in particular tells an amazing story. This is the skull of a 5-year-old child who underwent trepanning. From the front it appears perfectly normal, but on the top is what looks like a terrible injury, a large hole cut in the cranium about 6 centimeters across. But a closer examination revealed that the bone had been deliberately cut and that the child had survived after the operation. Earlier skulls had shown signs of deliberate removal of bone from fractures, but no one had seen anything like this child's skull. Dr. Paolo Catalano from Rome's Archaeological Service discovered this skull dated from the time of Galen.
E questo bambino è un bambino di circa 5-6 anni di età scheletrica stabilita dal grado di eruzione dei denti, ed è stato trovato in una necropoli di II secolo d.C., scavata alcuni anni fa a Fidene, nella zona del suburbio a nord di Roma.
The procedure on the skull closely resembled one recommended by Galen himself for some brain diseases. Perhaps this was the work of the master himself.
Questa caratteristica di lesione cranica rilevata subito al momento dello scavo ed è stata esaminata poi successivamente con delle tecniche abbastanza avanzate e ha dimostrato oltretutto, cosa estremamente interessante, questo studio, che la tecnica seguiva in maniera precisa i dettami di Galeno.
Galen explained how he had observed brain damage occurring in patients who had complaints such as inflammation of the brain, and recorded how this might be avoided by releasing the pressure using trepanation. This is what appears to have happened in the case of the young child.
In this case, the trepanation
was performed because of an expansive disease of the right cerebral hemisphere. So the surgeon at one point operated on this skull in order to relieve the pressure that developed inside the skull, and the child survived for a short period of time.
This was not simply an attempt to remove damaged bone, but closer to being a form of ancient brain surgery.
What is remarkable about this ancient cranial surgery is that it was performed to treat a disease of the brain and not to remove a cracked or damaged area of the bone itself. And this is what is amazing about this find.
Who at the time this child lived would have had the knowledge and skill to perform this complex operation other than Galen himself? We know much about Galen, as he was a great self-publicist who liked to write at least 3 pages a day and left hundreds of books to posterity. But this would prove a bitter legacy. His work was so revolutionary and his writing so prolific that when he died, other doctors took his work as being definitive and failed to continue his research.
Galen was the architect of his own failure. Subsequent generations couldn't cope with the amount he'd written, so they produced summaries, handbooks, giving what they thought was the major summaries of his ideas. What they left out was what makes Galen impressive today.
Even up until the 16th century, Galen's work was being used as reference, and from Galen's death to that time, hardly any further advances were made in Western medicine. Only in the last 500 years have anatomists critically examined his work and realized how much he had misunderstood. With only limited access to human bodies, Galen had based many of his theories on the study of animal anatomy, which later doctors found to be very different from our own. Galen has therefore been disregarded and dismissed for hundreds of years. It's only recently that we have started to look back and realize how much he actually got right and how close he had come to explaining the mysteries of the workings of the most complex machine of all, the human body.
I think Galen is underrated and deserves a better press. He is important and very modern in his concern in the practice of medicine, not only in a sense about healing people, their wounds and diseases, but also treating them as a complete patient. He inspires the modern medicine of treating the whole person.
William Harvey, the man who discovered the circulation of the blood in the 1700s, said Galen came so close to making the same discovery all those years earlier. But when Galen eventually died at the age of 87, the heroic age of the Roman Empire was already coming to an end, and with it the great age of medical discovery. He had been a man so ahead of his time that for centuries no one would question him. Then for centuries more, no one would believe him. Now we can perhaps finally look back and appreciate the amazing discoveries that he made and admire the audacity and brilliance of a man who would attempt operations not seen again anywhere on Earth for nearly 2 millennia. A man who laid the foundations of modern medicine in the ancient world.
Next on Full Throttle, Volkswagen really means people's car, and these little people movers have been around since World War II. We dusted them up, took them to the shop, allowed a bunch of guys to trick them out, and let them loose on the drag strip, the 1967 VW Beetle. Next on the History Channel.